Welcome, everybody. I'm Tricia Bell. I'm the president of the board of the San Francisco Bach Choir. We are so happy to have this opportunity to take a deep dive into the historical context of the St. John Passion. I'm so happy that you're all here to do that with us. Before we get started, I want to explain some logistics and make some introductions. First of all, the vital question of the restrooms. You go out the door and take a left down the hall. You'll see the sign for the restrooms. Don't forget to turn off your cell phones. I want to give a great big thank you to all of the many Bach Choir volunteers who have donated their time and their energy and their cookies to make this program go smoothly, especially to the planning committee, Kelsey Menahan, Rita Fermanis, and Hallie Holtzman, and to our AV crew, Mike Open and Nelson. Now I also would like to introduce our executive director, Martha Westland, who's sitting over there. And the thoughtful and inspirational support of our wonderful artistic director, Megan Solomon. Our performances of this work are taking place on Saturday, May 5th at 7 o'clock at the Calvary Presbyterian Church at the corner of Jackson and Fillmore in this city. And on Sunday, May 6th at 3 o'clock, the First Congregational Church of Berkeley. Tickets for both of these performances are on sale today at a special price of $25. That's $5 off of the buy-ahead online price and $10 off of the walk-in-the-door price. If you're not sure which day you want to come and can't buy them today, there's an ad in the handout that you got when you walked in that has the special password to get this special price. So the format for the day, we're going to start with each of our speakers giving a short presentation about Bach's St. John Passion and its historical context as seen through the lens of his or her particular expertise. And then our moderator, Tom Hall, will moderate a general discussion among the speakers. If at any time during the program you have a question you'd like to address to the speakers, please write it down on the piece of paper or index card and pencil that you picked up at the front, and raise your hand, and one of our ushers will pick up your question and bring it up front. Or if you need pencil and paper and you don't have it, hold up your hand and we'll supply that for you. The speakers will make every effort to address all the questions that come up, but we do have a limited time frame. And after the program, please stay with us for cookies and more conversation. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Tom Hall. He's the former music director of the Baltimore Choral Arts Society and co-author with historian Michael Marison and theologian Christopher Lighton of the Bach Passions in Our Time, which examines the role that Bach's St. John Passion and St. Matthew Passion have played in the long history of religious intolerance. Tom.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon. It's great to see you. How y'all doing today? Good. Before we get going, let me suggest we do the following. Find somebody whose name you don't know and introduce yourself. All right, now don't get too chummy. One of the reasons, well, there's a whole lot of reasons to do that, but one of the reasons to do that is that the first rule of any polite dinner party or public event is never talk about religion and politics. I got bad news for you. The only things we're going to talk about today are religion and politics. But I am delighted to be in one of my favorite cities on one of my favorite kind of days. You delivered it up beautifully, and I'm just really glad to be here. And I am very, very grateful to the San Francisco Bach Choir for undertaking this event in conjunction with their performances. So bravi tutti to Megan and to the board and to everybody who has seen fit to have a conversation about a bunch of very complicated issues. St. John Passion is a masterpiece. Hopefully we can all agree on that. You will find in the course of our discussion this afternoon, because I've been doing these kinds of discussions since 1991, and it is almost always the case that by the end of the discussion, you're going to hear things that you vehemently disagree with. You're going to hear things that very much challenge notions that you've grown up with, notions that you've heard as just part of the atmosphere of your lives. You're going to hear things that just plain tick you off. But it is a beautiful, wonderful, complicated piece, and it's important to engage these complications and to engage the ways in which we approach them. So there's three things that I want to start with as a sort of a premise. The first is sort of self-evident, but we've got to remind ourselves that music has a particular power and a particular capacity when it comes to text, right? So if we accept the premise that the text of the Gospel of John is very anti-Jewish, very intolerant of the Jewish tradition, and we can make the argument that it is, I think, right? But if you accept that fact, right, and then you have a piece in which 45% of the words come from that gospel, right? Not more than half of the words, and that's a good thing to remember. 55% of the words that you'll hear on Saturday and Sunday in a couple of weeks come from poets that were clergy who worked with Bach, right? And only 45% of it actually comes from the gospel itself. But those words, when they are hurtful to people raised in the Jewish faith, when they are offensive, when they have been used by others to justify violence and persecution of Jews throughout history, those words, when they are beautiful, are made beautifuler by Bach's music. When they are ugly, they are made uglier by a lot by Bach's music. Because music has the capacity to enlarge, to illuminate words in a particular way. Think about this. You're in the 8th grade. Mrs. Perkins, your beloved English teacher, says the assignment for tomorrow is to write a poem. Now, you're not a very good poet, but you really like Mrs. Perkins and you want to do well by her. So you go home and you try your hardest, and you write and you throw away, and you write and you throw away, and you write and you throw away. You finally come up with something you think you can do. You get to school the next day. Mrs. Perkins says, "You're on." You stand up and you say, "Yesterday, all my troubles were so far away. Now I need a place to hide away. Oh, I believe in yesterday." And Mrs. Perkins says, "You're not really good at poetry." The banality of that is pretty clear, right? Then you're Paul McCartney, and you're 20 years old, and you wake up one morning and you have a tune going on in your head. You're not sure whether you wrote it or whether you heard it from someplace else. You spend 6 weeks asking people in the record business, "Have you ever heard this tune? Does this ring a bell?" No. And he attaches the word scrambled eggs to a tune that you all know. Scrambled eggs. Oh, I really, really love your legs, but not as much as I love scrambled eggs. That's the first version of that song. So what does he do? He takes the word yesterday, and he doesn't do anything fancy to it. Oops. And he doesn't turn on his piano. So how do I do this? It was on a minute ago. All right, sorry. Oh, there you go. Okay, here we go. All right. So he takes the word yesterday and he puts it in the key of F major. So that's the note that the key of F major is based on, right? He simply goes up one note from the note that the key is based on, and he simply utters the word. He doesn't do anything fancy. It's not yesterday, right? He doesn't do that. He simply utters the word the way you would say it. Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away. Now I need a place to hide away. Oh, I believe in yesterday. All of a sudden, that incredibly banal poem becomes a profound work of art. Because there's not a human being on the planet that doesn't understand the melancholy for what once was, or for an unrequited love, or for a love that was great that is lost. But what makes that banal poem so beautiful? It's the melody, and the harmony, and the rhythm. And music can give us a prism into words, sometimes the same word, a prism that we get from different prisms with different music, right? Bach. Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison. I've been accused of a lot of things, never been being a soprano, right? So that's the B minor Mass, right? And he takes this very complicated, very long-winded, weird thing, and he makes an 11-minute fugue, or if you're Herbert von Karajan, a 17-minute fugue, right? And he makes this gigantic big deal about it, right? Haydn takes the same words. What's that? Calls it the Missa in Angustis, the Mass in a tight squeeze, right? And the chorus comes in, Kyrie, Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison. That's tight squeeze music, right? It's the same word, but it means something very different than Kyrie, right? So music has the capacity to do that. It has a capacity to alter the way we look at a text, and it has a capacity to enlarge and illuminate the way we hear a text. Very different experience than reading it or hearing it read and hearing it sung. Right? The second thing to keep in mind, Bach had an agenda. He was not writing for the concert hall, he was writing for the church. He wrote for the busiest musical day of the year, Good Friday. All of his passions, he wrote 4 of them, 2 of them survived, Matthew and John. The first part, they sang. Second part, they waited until there was a sermon in between. All right, so part 1, sermon, part 2. Right, the St. Matthew Passion is 3 hours long. The St. John Passion, about half that long, closer to 290 or so minutes. Right, so Bach is preaching. He is preaching literally to his choir and to his congregation. So our understanding of this piece has to be premised on what our understanding of what he was preaching was. Was he preaching that the Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus, the charge of deicide? Because it is that charge, that central charge, that deicide, the deicide charge against the Jews, which has been used to justify pogroms and persecutions of Jews throughout history. Is that the message of the St. John Passion? Right, the question often comes up, was Bach an anti-Semite? It's a question we'll perhaps deal with this afternoon. We know Wagner was, right? Does that make Wagner's music terrible? Right? Now, I don't conduct it personally. On the other hand, my phone isn't ringing off the hook, people begging me to conduct Lohengrin, but, it's Bill Nye, the 19th century philosopher, I think, had it well when he said, Wagner's music is better than it sounds. But that's just my own personal opinion, right? So don't write that down, right? So, can you separate the art from the artist? Do we need to do that in the case of the St. John Passion? What do we need to know about Bach and his milieu? And for that matter, what do we need to know about Jesus and the milieu of first century Palestine? Who was Jesus? Who was Pilate? Who was Caiaphas? Who were the Romans? There's a whole lot we don't know about Jesus. We do know that he was born somewhere 2nd or 3rd CE, and he died on or about Passover in 30 or so CE. We know that part. That part's real. Jesus was not a mythical figure. Jesus was a real guy. We have the supporting documents, not only the Gospels in the New Testament, but we have a thing called Q and a thing from a history called Josephus and people like that. So he's a real guy. So what do we know about this real guy? Right? What do you know about what he said, what he thought? What do we know about these other guys? We know that Pontius Pilate was the prefect in Jerusalem for 10 years, from 26 to 36, and that he got fired 3 or 4 years after the crucifixion of Jesus for being too violent. We know that Jesus was one of hundreds of people who Pilate chose to have killed in a very public way. Crucifixions are crowd control, right? They are done on the street. They are not done in a prison with all the windows closed, right? Why is Jesus chosen to be one of these hundreds of people who gets crucified by Pilate? What's Pilate's agenda? What's the Roman deal here? And what's the deal with the Jewish elders who were active at the time? Paula Fredrickson, a good buddy of mine who is a wonderful Jesus scholar, she's on the faculty of Boston University, also reminds us that the best way to get confused about Jesus is to read the 4 Gospels in the Christian New Testament. The Gospel of John has Jesus going up, down, left, right, here, Samaria, Galilee, Nazareth, Jerusalem, going to Jerusalem a bunch of different times, which would mean that when he makes his triumphal entry before he gets killed in the Gospel of John, Pilate knows who he is. The other 3 Gospels have him going to Jerusalem once, the day before he dies. So it means if that's true, then he goes to Jerusalem and Pilate has no idea who he is. Right? So that the stories are different. And what we understand about the stories are different. And the other thing is that each of us, we know something about first century Palestine, we know something about 18th century Leipzig, Germany, and then we know something about our own experience in 21st century America. Right? Christians and Jews read this text differently, hear this music differently. Blacks and whites have a different relationship to Jesus, generally speaking. Hindus, Buddhists, atheists have a different relationship. So all of these relationships play into how we understand the story and how we understand how Bach is presenting the story. Right? So we will explore that with our friends here on this panel today, and we'll, of course, as Trish mentioned, involve your questions as well. But there's a lot of things to think about and a lot of things to ponder. We're not going to solve all of the problems of the world today, but I hope we will ask enough questions that will help inform your understanding and enjoyment of the piece when you hear it in a couple of weeks. So first I want to introduce Jonathan Sheehan. He is the co-founder and co-director of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion at Berkeley. He works in the history of European Christianity, and he has a particular interest in the history of theology. So as I said, each of us will lather on for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll talk amongst ourselves and talk with you. But let's welcome Jonathan Sheehan.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to the organizers of this event and everybody for coming out to this. I have none. I'm not going to go over and play the piano for you. I'm not going to extemporaneously sing Bach for you. My musical knowledge is actually fairly limited, I would say, but I'm hoping that I can offer some relevant points of orientation for the conversation that I think is a really important one that we're going to have here today. So I thought it would be useful to set out 3 general areas of discussion, all of them that are interesting to me as a historian, more or less, of the reception of the Bible in the modern period. So the first, I think, has to do with the peculiar and particular status of the Gospel of St. John inside of the New Testament. So I don't know how much people know about this stuff, so I'm going to pretend like people don't know that much. But you might know that the Gospels, generally speaking, are written later than the epistles of Paul, than most of the New Testament letters. They are the kind of concretization of a tradition of stories about the life of Christ that come into focus over a period of time. The New Testament letters, if you go look at them, are, in general, not very interested in Christ's life. They are interested in his death, but they are very interested in the formation and expansion of the Christian church. So we know that they're thinking about as a kind of creation of a community of Christians. Now, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as they're called, are deeply interested in the life of Christ, as you all know. They're interested in his mother, They're interested in his father. They're interested in his birth. They're interested in the personal relations between him and his disciples. They're very interested in the miracles and the exorcisms that he performs. These are crucial to the kind of content of the Synoptic Gospels. And they're not particularly interested in the church, and they're not very interested in what we later might call theology. Now, the Gospel of John, then, in that kind of comparative context, stands out as something rather unusual. You won't find, for example, if you open it up, any mention that Jesus was born. He just seems to appear, more or less, as a full-grown Word made flesh. You won't find any mention of Mary, none of the little domestic details that the Synoptic Gospels like to kind of to mobilize, to give us a texture of Christ's life. What you will find, though, is a ton of theological stuff. From the Gospel of John, Christians develop doctrines of the Trinity, of the co-equivalence of Jesus and God, of the eternality of Christ. He was as it opens, he was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. This is an idea that's entirely original inside the Gospel tradition. That has no connection, really. You won't find anything like that in the Synoptic Gospels. Now, you'll also find, and this is, I think, the topic of our conversation, a very conscious and startling and often to us disturbing interest in marking the distinction between those who are inside and those who are outside the holy communities, what Christians later, when there are Christians, will call a church. Now, what tends to name for John, the John author, and I might just say John, but the John author, what names those outside the holy community is the word Jews. Judeans sometimes gets written in English, a word that's used actually fairly rarely in the Synoptic Gospels, but is all over the Gospel of John, something like 80 times. Every single chapter of the fourth Gospel, with the exceptions by my count of chapters 13 to 17, when Christ is talking to his disciples at the Last Supper, and chapter 20, when he dies and is resurrected, has staged some conflict between Jesus and his disciples on the one hand, and those the gospel authors calls Jews or Pharisees, which is an interesting, and we maybe talk about that, a particular group of Jews that the John author is very concerned with. Now, a little context might be useful. I'm not a scholar of the New Testament, but the consensus among those scholars seems to be that it's unhelpful to think of the Gospel of John in its own time as representing a conflict between what we now think of as Christians and Jews. There are no Christians, per se, at the end of the first century, when the Gospel was likely to have been composed sometime between 90 and 110 of CE. There were Jews who, like the Gospel author, affirmed the messianic status of Christ, and those who did not. And one, to my mind, useful way to understand the gospel then is as staging a conflict between different communities of Jews. And this helps explain why the John author takes what are, in the Synoptic Gospels, these collections of miracle events from Christ's life. So, for example, the ability of Christ to heal the blind. And in each case, the John author turns them into a kind of a conflict story. That is the real story of Jesus' ability to heal the blind is a kind of allegory for how the Pharisees and Jews are unable to see what is right before their nose. Quote, he says at the end of chapter 9, I believe, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who do see," that is, the Pharisees or think they see, "may become blind." So one of the cruxes of this conflict between this community and the community, this sort of sect, this holy community, that's the John's community somewhere in Palestine, has to be around the divinity of Christ himself. At the end of John chapter 8, the Jews say to Christ, "You're not yet," the Jews, as the John author says, say to Christ, "You're not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" And Jesus replies to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." Repeating God's words to Moses at the burning bush, "I am who I am." So I find it helpful in thinking about Bach to recall where this gospel story came from in the first place, and to think how much... I can still read. And then there wasn't light, exactly. There we go. All right. Shoo. I find it helpful helpful in thinking about the source text for the John Passion to keep in our mind what this John Passion was about when it was written. The way the John author is staging a set of conflicts in his own world, and then giving them and attributing them and landing them in the lap of Christ. A conversation which is ongoing at a moment before something like Christianity came to be. Now, and this is my second discussion, later when Christianity emerges as something which is fully defined, which imagines itself, which now thinks of itself as a group with a boundary, and that calls itself the boundary of Christianity, the gospel later will become a shorthand for the enmity between Christians and Jews, which is how it comes preserved to us and why we're here today talking about it. So I thought a few just orienting words about this issue from the point of view of the history of Christianity. Somehow something got a little confused here. So Christianity, though. So if we want to start from where I just left off with John, we want to think that Christianity is built partly out of the sense of a conflict between those who deny the divinity of Christ and those who affirm it inside of this community. And the shorthand for the former, those who defy, is usually Jews. Now, it could also be pagans, right? They also deny the divinity of Christ. But the specific challenge of Judaism for Christianity as it comes to develop is how much it formed the textual, cultural, and ritual foundation of what Christianity took itself to be. So the pagans, Pilate, for example, their opponents, they obviously deny the divinity of Christ. The issue with Jews that makes them more difficult for Christians to think about is how much of what of the textual, social, imaginative world that Judaism presented in the early church gets recruited, absorbed, and brought inside of Christianity. So Christianity has a durable Jewish problem, if I could call it that, precisely because it remains so dependent on and in dialogue with, theologically but also practically, Jewish texts, and depending on the period, Jewish people and societies. So the pagans, like long-term, are not really such a big deal once they get more or less recruited into the Christian world or stamped out. Now, just for a quick example of this kind of the uneasiness of neighbors, right? Neighbors are your great enemy at some level. The Gospel of John is crucial in Holy Week liturgies, right? This is what we know from Bach's composition of the piece for Good Friday. The Holy Week liturgies when Christians celebrate the death and resurrection of Christ. Now, Holy Week, it's important to realize, is one of those places where Christianity touches most intimately on its Jewish foundations. I mean, this is the point where these two worlds come most tightly into contact. Not only does Easter almost always coincide with Passover, and it's the only major festival, major overlap in the festival calendar, but the liturgy of the Mass stages something of that proximity with conflict that characterizes Christian understandings of Judaism all the time. So violence against Jews in medieval and early modern Europe was often linked to Holy Week celebrations, so much so that Jews were often confined to quarters, more or less, during this week by authorities who were interested in preventing popular violence. So seen from a longer perspective, it seems like the sense of conflict that the Bach's St. John's Gospel raises to our view is not something particular to Bach, but it's just essential to Christianity itself. I mean, it seems to me that Bach isn't really the issue. Christianity is the issue. The way that it develops certain exegetical, social, and political points of view out of texts like the Gospel of John. And so Bach makes visible something which is effectively present, by the way, for those who don't know, in every Easter liturgy across much of the Christian world. I mean, it's just, you get to see it in Bach when you go to the First Congregational Church or to some concert hall. So if you want to think seriously about the problem of anti-Semitism, you would need pieces like this played outside of ecclesiastical and liturgical settings so that you can see them, right? Because this is happening, these conversations are happening in kind of unannotated ways inside of, in the Holy Week, every actually not just in the Holy Week, but every year in Christianity worldwide. So the denaturalizing of the ordinary structure of the Christian imagination would seem important if you want to engineer anti-Semitism out of it. And so perhaps by having a conversation like this, by putting the passion in front of you and saying, well, isn't that something painful to think about? That's part of starting a conversation about Christianity, actually. Now, my last point has to do with one small theological issue and one small issue in the history of Christian biblical study. Now, there seems to be some debate that Tom would know this much better than me, whether Bach was a kind of Enlightenment interpreter of Christianity or simply a good Lutheran. In fact, there was an article in the New York Times the other day that was very scornful of people who thought of had the first point of view. And I suspect that author, whose name I've now forgotten, was right, that Bach was a good Lutheran, which is not necessarily a bad thing, in my view. However prejudiced, and we'll hear more about Luther might have been against the Jews, and he was violently so. He always insisted on the fundamental sinfulness of the Christian. He called it simultaneously justified and a sinner, simul justus et peccator. For Bach and for Luther, therefore, Christians stand under the wrathful judgment of God for the killing of Christ, just as Jews do. That's what it means to stand in a relationship of violence towards and non-recognition towards the reality of God. The difference is that Christians turn to God's mercy through the intervention of the sacrificed Son. So there's a possibility of being justified, of being made right. But the sin is the same sin, and that's the theological point, it seems to me, or at least it's a long-standing one, and worth talking about, because it seems to me that anti-Semitism gets even more violent the more Christians lose this sense of their own sinfulness. The kind of equality of sinfulness between the Christian and the Jew is only as you lose that, the possibility of isolating the Jews as a sort of uniquely sinful set of Christ killers becomes possible. Now, and then the last couple points on the issue of Christian biblical study. Christians have always known how weird it was to have 4 gospel stories from the very beginning, 2nd or 3rd century. There's a so-called diatessaron, trying to put these 4 stories into conversation with one another. The first time that Christians really started to pull them apart, to imagine that the Gospel of John has to be understood as a theological document on its own terms and not in conversation with the other ones, was only at the end of the 18th century, long after Bach died. So that's a conversation. In a way, we stand in the shadow of that, where I can talk about the theology of John rather than the theology of Mark. And that's a particular modern point of view that Bach would not have understood. What became called biblical theology made it possible to think of the Christian Bible as a kind of theological buffet, which you might just pick parts that you liked as you migrated around it. Now, this has its advantages. It's a sense that it's certainly okay to listen to the St. Matthew Passion, although maybe there's a conversation to be had about the St. Matthew Passion too. But it's better to listen to St. Matthew Passion, but we're worried about the St. John Passion, as if these two things weren't connected in some integral way. This seems to have some relationship to this kind of buffet theory of the Bible. The fact that it was to my knowledge, and I'll be corrected, I think, in a minute, that it was Mendelssohn in 19th century Berlin who helped to make the St. Matthew Passion so wildly successful suggests a certain kind of, suggests in any case a connection to this new approach to the Bible, that you might just pull one of these passions out and make it a kind of an acceptable one, and the other one you might want to be a little more nervous about. Now, this, I think, also has its so that's kind of interesting. It also has its disadvantages because, in a certain way, the St. John Passion is no longer kind of constrained imaginatively by its relationship to the other more down-to-earth humanistic stories of Christ's life that are told in the other Gospels, so that it leaves it harder to understand and more vulnerable to misuse. I believe, and I was trying to find this, I think that there's a National Socialist version of the Gospel of John, because they think, well, that's a really good gospel. We like that one. Maybe the other one's not so much. So in the end, then, I think the staging of the John Passion seems like an invitation to these kinds of conversations about the history of the Bible, history of Christianity, relationship to Judaism, the status of religious objects in secular society, since I take it much of our concern here is not with the fact that they might sing it in church, but they're going to sing it in a church in a non-liturgical setting. I have no interest in exculpating Bach from anti-Semitism or elevating art to some transcendent status that it leaves history behind. On the contrary, it seems to me that art like this, moving and disturbing, is an invitation to precisely conversations about the things that about over our history hold us together and then also drive us apart. So that's what I have to say to get a conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. That's great. Some really important points. And again, the chronology of the Gospels, keep this in mind. John is the latest one, right? Mark is first. Matthew and Luke tend to be based sort of on Mark. And then 40, 50 years later, you have John. So the audience for John is very different. The audience for Matthew, Mark, and Luke is Jewish. The audience from John, generally speaking, is non-Jewish, right? My last count of the mention of Iude, the Greek word for John, is 74 in the Gospel of John. 71 of them are negative. 71 are negative, and the other 3 are neutral, right? So John is, in a very simplistic way, saying, look, you Gentiles, don't be stupid like the Jews, right? And here's why he demonizes the Jews, to convince the Gentiles to come along and join the sect, right? But
I actually don't think that that's right. So we could have our. I think at least my reading of the scholarship seems to be that this is not an address to the Gentiles. This is addressed to another community inside of the larger Jewish world, and this is so they're not. So the Jews stand as the kind of outside frame inside of which this holier community wants to form itself, but not saying the way Paul would say, for example, later on, that what we're thinking about here is an expansion of this teaching out into a Gentile world. So it's a funny document for just that. I'm sorry, I'm already starting a discussion.
No, that's okay. And that's a great point.
We'll talk about this later.
Yeah, but it is fascinating what's not in John and what is in the others, and vice versa. You can find the birth story in the Quran, but you can't find it in the Gospel of John. John begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Right? And this is not the second chapter of Luke. There were shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flocks by night. And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, the glory of the Lord shone around about them, blah, blah, blah. All right, so let's listen to a little bit of a gentleman who knows an awful lot about the Jewish history part of it. This is John Efron. He's the Court Professor of Jewish History at UC Berkeley, who specializes in the cultural and social history of German Jewry in particular. He's an expert in anti-Semitism, and he'll describe the world and culture of 18th century German Jews at the time of the St. John Passion, which was premiered at Leipzig in 1724. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and thank you for coming. First thing I want to say is whatever your image of German Jewry is, if you have an image of German Jewry, it would be reasonable to assume it was this sort of galaxy of superstars that appeared between really 1871 and 1933. The Freuds and the Einsteins and the Mahlers and everybody else. That's not the picture of the Jews. That is not representative of what the Jews looked like in Bach's day, by any stretch of the imagination. It wasn't until 1871 that the Jews were first emancipated, that is to say, given legal rights. And even then it was incomplete, right? They only had full legal rights for a very, very brief period, actually 1918, 1919. And then it was all finished by 1933. So what I want to talk about, so just to set the scene here, what did Bach and other Germans see when they left their homes, when they walked out on the street in terms of Jews? What did they see when they encountered their Jewish neighbors? Well, first of all, how many Jews would Germans have seen? In 1700, in Prussia, which is the area where we're speaking about here, there were about 25,000 Jews in a country of many, many millions. By 1750, which is the year Bach died, there were about 65,000. So still a very small number. Now, what were these Jews? They were an extremely traditional, deeply pious religious community, for the most part, with a handful of exceptions, relative handful of exceptions. They did not speak German. They couldn't even read a Latin script. They spoke Yiddish, and they lived a deeply, deeply traditional life, Jewish life. Christian society was, at this time, just as traditional as Jewish society. Now, what does this mean when it comes to their neighbours, their Jewish neighbours? The Jews are largely seen as Christ killers, as godless, superstitious, venal, uncultured, and physically repulsive. And of significance for our subject matter here, they were considered also to be an auditory assault on Christian ears, basically. That is to say, Jews were seen or heard to make an unpleasant, cacophonous din, whether speaking or whether with their liturgical music. In fact, there's an expression in German for, if a mother goes into a room and the kids are making a big noise, the expression translates as, stop making a noise as if you're in a Jewish school. Lernen wie in einer Judenschule. Right, that is the expression. So there's a very well-established sense that the Jews are, in every way, shape, or form, an assault. Now, that's sort of the popular view, but even learned opinion was at best ambivalent and at worst shared the popular vision of Jews. Still in the 18th century, the church is actively trying to convert Jews. There's still forced attendance in some territories. Jews are forced to attend Christian worship service at least once a year or listen to sermons. With the advent of the Pietist movement, a different approach was made, less draconian, one that extended the hand of brotherly love to Jews as a more effective, I think it was heartfelt as well, but it was also a more effective way to try and win souls. One way, rather than have them go and listen to sermons, is that the Pietists published a Yiddish version of the New Testament to try and attract Jews. But this was still a world in the 18th century that were heirs to a raft of medieval charges. Jews as practitioners of ritual murder, Jews as practitioners of host desecration, Jews as poisoners of the drinking wells of Europe, as was the case. Literally tens and tens of thousands of Jews were killed over the course of centuries on the basis of those spurious charges. And while some of those charges had fallen into disfavor, particularly in the Protestant world, charges like host desecration and things like that, and ritual murder, nonetheless, it's very hard to unsee or unhear what you have heard and seen. And so the legacy of those medieval charges still leaves its impress on the world in the 18th century. Those views largely inform social policy towards the Jews, and that's what I want to speak about now. It is at the root cause of their economic circumstances. What are the economic circumstances of the Jews? They are extremely, extremely poor, by and large poverty-stricken. There are myriad occupational and residential restrictions on them. They have very few legal rights. They live essentially at the whim and caprice of the rulers of the territories in which they live. They are excluded from most trades. There are onerous taxes, duties, levies, surcharges, body taxes. You pay a tax just for being Jewish, in addition to other taxes. If you entered a town well into the 18th century, there was a Jew's gate through which you entered the town. And at that gate you were stopped, searched, and you were made to pay a tax. If you take the city of Frankfurt, for example, Frankfurt is the largest Jewish ghetto in Europe and the largest Jewish community in Germany. There were, in Frankfurt, 34 separate taxes that Jews paid that Christians did not have to pay. A whole raft of them, including a thing called a ticket tax. And Jonathan made reference to this, actually. A ticket tax was you had to buy a ticket to be able to leave the ghetto on a Sunday or on a Christian holiday. So they charged you a small fortune to be able to leave. Generally, once a year, sometimes twice a year, Jews were required to provide higher municipal officials in places wherever they lived with an expensive gift. Now, those coerced purchases of tickets and payment of levies and things like that, in return, Jews had to pay large amounts of money for marriage certificates, death certificates, business and other certificates and permits. The luckiest of Jews had what were called letters of patent or letters of protection. They're called in German Schutzbriefe, protection, letters of protection. Letters of protection allowed Jews to settle. It gave them the right to settle in a particular region and to engage in commerce of an approved kind in return for essentially protection money. You essentially had to pay. Now, those letters of protection only worked in specific areas, so they are delineated territorially and could be revoked at any time. All official members of Jewish communities, that is sort of the leadership of the Jewish communities, were considered protected Jews in that way, as were religious officials. And that means that there were lots of fictive appointments. So again, just to stick with the musical theme, very tiny synagogues seem to have 3, 4, 5, and 6 cantors, right? So they would be able to be protected by letters of protection. Okay. The majority of Jews were not so fortunate. The majority of Jews lived without any form of formal protection. They had no residence rights and could only engage in menial labor. The restrictions were so onerous that it often led Jews to break the law in order to live. That only further sort of exacerbated or instantiated the a priori opinions about Jews, that this is a criminally guilty people. If Jews moved into the cities from the countryside, that was an illegal move. Large numbers of Jews were beggars. They were the proverbial schnorrer, which was an official category. It's not just a term of opprobrium, but it is an official category. There were about 3,000 Jews in Berlin in the 18th century. In 1700, 1,000 of them are officially classified as beggars. Right? That also reinforces stereotypes about them. As far as earning a living is concerned, essentially everything that was not expressly permitted was forbidden. Right? Everything that wasn't expressly permitted was forbidden. They couldn't trade in any new items. Any item or goods that were new, they were not permitted to trade in it. So they were reduced to largely dealing in second-hand clothes and bric-a-brac, pawnbroking, and changing money. That's about it. all of those jobs were considered occupations of disrepute. Grinding poverty is the order of the day. Poverty often led to crime, as I mentioned, both real and imagined, and also anomalies before the law. So Jews were frequently, of course, because of this economic situation, in debt. If a Jew falls into debt, the entire Jewish community is responsible for the payment of that debt. So there is a constant sort of form of collective punishment hanging over the community, but particularly the wealthy members of the community, because they're the ones that have to pick up the tab. Okay? The Jew comes before the courts. Jewish punishments were always more severe the punishments were more severe for Jews than they were for Christians accused of the same crimes. For example, both Christians and Jews are sentenced to death for various crimes. The punishment for Jews up until the 18th century tended to be, in the main part, for the Jew to hang by his feet, upside down, and next to him on a pole, and next to him were two ravenous wild dogs who hung and bit the Jew to death, essentially. Torture was used in Germany to extract confessions into the 19th century. It was legal. Also tended to be used more frequently against Jews. Oaths. When a Jew went to court into the 19th century, but certainly in the 18th century, Jews had to take a particular Jewish oath before the court. Into the early modern period, sort of in some places into the 18th century, that oath was taken while standing barefoot on a pigskin. It's all part of a whole process, a ceremonial form or ritual form of humiliation, and a sort of a ritualized form of anti-Semitism. As the 18th century wore on, the situation actually got worse. One would have thought that it would have gotten better, but the 18th century saw conditions deteriorate for most Jews. There's a small band of Jews for whom it goes in the other direction, but for the majority, it deteriorates in the 18th century. All policies with regards to Jews were taken up by what are called Jewish commissions. That is to say, the government actually had an Office for Jewish Affairs. That Office for Jewish Affairs was essentially busy working out new taxes, new levies, new ways to restrict the commerce, residential rights, occupational activities of Jews. Increasing number of taxes, those taxes that I mentioned before, are increased throughout the course of the 18th century. In 1748, Frederick the Great prohibited Jews, Jewish men obviously, from shaving. Right? They were forced to shave to maintain their beards. He thought that it would be easier to apprehend Jewish thieves that way. By 1750, the Jews were divided into 6 different legal categories. Each one from the ones living under the most generous letters of protection, all the way down to those who didn't have any protection at all, and each category more onerous than the one that preceded it. In 1769, I know it's after Bach died, but the impetus, sort of the cultural impetus, the psychological impetus, sort of precedes this date of 1769. In 1769, Frederick the Great imposes a thing called a porcelain tax, where Jews are forced to buy from the royal porcelain factory damaged porcelain for a certain amount. They had to buy a certain amount every year, and of course they got stuck with this porcelain that was either cracked or crazed or whatever. They couldn't sell it at full prices. So it's just one thing after another. Now, Bach would have seen a lot of Jews. Most Germans wouldn't have seen. There's only a small number of Jews, so most of them would not have actually seen a lot of Jews. Bach, however, would have seen a lot of Jews because he lived in Leipzig. And Leipzig every year has an annual fair. Dates from the Middle Ages, and it is still around today. There's an annual fair in Leipzig. Every year, Bach would have seen a huge influx of Jews into the city. In fact, I can tell you exactly how many. Between 1675 and 1764, a total of 81,937 Jews visited Leipzig. Now, we know that because they were under surveillance. They kept very, very close tabs on them. But that's a lot of Jews. Now, not only did they help the fair grow, especially in certain areas, particularly what they brought to Leipzig, among other things, was the fur trade, and helped grow that. One of the reasons that the city of Leipzig loved having these Jews is they had to pay their Jewish tax to get into the city. So their presence at the annual fair was a huge windfall for the city of Leipzig. There were tremendous complaints and representations by Christian merchants who wanted the Jews banned from the Leipzig fair. But it was just too good a deal for the city. And of course, the Christian merchants were overturned in their representations to the city. Essentially, the Jews, all of this sort of reinforced the view of the Jews as chattel. They are, as they had been in the Middle Ages, there for the purposes of enrichment. There was no one was doing any favours by letting them settle in. The letters of patent were not handed out because a particular prince in a territory liked this or that Jew. There had to be some sort of utilitarian function. That was always the way it had always been since the Middle Ages, and that was the way that it still was. Now, even amid this poverty and really a world of sort of relentless contempt and anti-Semitism, both in just terms of popular expression and policy, we see the bonds, we still see the sort of the communal bonds weakening within the Jewish community. As isolated and as marginal as they were on the one hand, we begin to see in the 18th century, maybe a little bit before, but certainly by the early 18th century, attempts by Jews to adopt certain aspects of Christian culture. Jews had always adopted certain aspects of Christian culture. We've just had Passover, for example. So for those who have been to a Seder, you dip your finger in the wine, right, when reciting the 10 plagues, but that's just a Greek drinking game, right? An ancient Greek drinking game at the symposium. So there's always been that kind of thing. But it becomes a deeply, deeply Jewish activity, right? Ceremony, ritual. But in the 18th century, we begin to see attempts to partake of the larger culture that truly frighten the communal authorities. Let me read to you some communal ordinances. This one is from 1715. No new fashions may be introduced. The application of artificial beauty marks for girls and women is prohibited. So that means Jews are well aware of what the latest fashions are. They are wearing them. Women are applying these sort of beauty spots. And the heads of the communities are deeply opposed to it. They repeat that particular ordinance in 1726, which means that the ordinance of 1715 didn't take root, right? Young people in particular were not listening. Here's another one from 1726 from Hamburg. Jews of both sexes are prohibited from walking to public houses or inns, or from visiting bowling alleys, fencing schools, or comedies on the Sabbath and holidays. Women under no circumstance should attend the opera. Right? That is written in the communal register of the Hamburg Jewish community. In 1698, and then again repeated in 726, we get this one, which is really my favourite. It is forbidden under penalty of 10 Reichstaler that on certain holidays no one is allowed to shoot gunpowder or launch rockets in the synagogue. They must also abstain from hitting, throwing and wrestling, punishable by a fine of 4 Reichstaler. So some things never change, right? If you've been to a synagogue, people are sitting up the back talking, right? So this is not a new phenomenon of the modern world. It's already in the early modern world and probably in the medieval world. So synagogue attendance was a rowdy affair, right, at the very least. But it also shows that during the Baroque age, when fireworks became an incredibly important part of European celebrations, Jews also were beginning to include things like fireworks in the synagogues. Even though the communal elders didn't want them to be doing it, it is done in imitation. It's incredibly dangerous because most of these places are wood, so they're going to go up in flames. So there's a fire hazard as well. But in addition to the fire hazard that's posed by the use of fireworks, it is seen as essentially a non-Jewish form of celebration, and so therefore it has no place in the synagogue or within the Jewish community, except for the fact that it suddenly does, because that's what the young people are doing. So while we have a community that is marginalised, that is impoverished, that is derided, looked at contemptuously, in addition to everything I've said here, so for example, there's just nursery rhymes, little poems. Children would shout things at Jews, throw things at Jews on the streets. It was an extremely, it's difficult to sort of appreciate how on a daily basis Jews dealt with this, because it's extremely foreign to our own way of thinking. But to some extent, being yelled at or being called Christ killers, while not necessarily pleasant, was probably for most Jews just water off a duck's back. Part of the background noise of living in the 17th and 18th century. A book comes out, I'll finish up very shortly, a book comes out in 1700 by a professor of Oriental languages at the University of Heidelberg, so a learned man, and it's called Judaism Revealed, or Judaism Uncovered. It's 2 volumes, a total of 2,120 pages of relentless denigration, extremely influential denigration, all intended to show the extent to which Jews hated Christians. This is one assertion after another, using Jewish texts, all very faithfully translated by this author, a man by the name of Eisenmenger. He knew Hebrew very, very well, and Aramaic. But of course he distorted and twisted those texts. For him, Judaism is just a sort of a collection of superstitions, irrational rituals, and the Jews themselves are misanthropes. That's a very old charge already. Tacitus, the Roman author, had claimed the Jews were misanthropes, that they hate everybody else except themselves. What's interesting about this particular text, and why I'm mentioning it, is it comes out in 1700. It seems very late. It's sort of like a last gasp vestige of medieval accusations. It includes the charge that the Jews are continually trying to kill their neighbours and rob their neighbours, etc. And it is to some extent a last gasp of the medieval era. But in some areas, the book wasn't published due to lobbying efforts by Jews to have the book banned. And they were, in some regions, successful. In other regions, they weren't. Okay. But I want to mention another book from 1714. It's a 4-volume work called Jewish Curiosities. And it's the work of an Orientalist, a man by the name of Schutt. It's a 4-volume work of ethnography where he describes the Jews' homes and their holidays, their literature and their religion. And it's a very, very faithful description. But he includes many of Eisenmenger's charges as well. So we're on the cusp of sort of really faithful ethnographic. No one had looked at the Jews as a real people before, with customs and sort of the rituals of daily existence, and written about it for a Christian audience before this guy Schutt did in this 4-volume work, Jewish Curiosities. But there are still in this work, as interesting as it is, references to Eisenmenger as being an authority, right? So we're still at this cusp. But he also strikes a uniquely modern and perhaps ominous tone. He has a whole chapter on the Jewish body, the descriptions of the Jewish body, its shape, its appearance, and he even has an entire section entitled in block letters on the smell of the Jews. So with that, we sort of are moving into a different kind of anti-Semitic world, a world that is that focuses on physiology as opposed to theology, a world that focuses on practices as opposed to beliefs, as a world that focuses on what Jews do among themselves. Relatively faithful renderings in parts of this book, and rather dubious interpretations of what those rituals mean. So by the time this is 1714, but it's a book that goes through a number of editions. So by the time that Bach is around, when these works are still written, right? He's still got another 50 years to go when Eisenmenger publishes his work Judaism Revealed. That's the world that this is the world that Bach sees. This is the world that Bach is aware of. These are the Jews that Bach observes when they come to Leipzig every year, and these are the Jews who are so heavily surveilled and policed and taxed and levied, and are so marginal, thereby, as I say, instantiating impressions of the Jews that see them as less than people. The behavior, the actions and policies of the various courts reaffirm this idea that they are less than people and should be treated as such. Okay, thank you.
We see how the roots of anti-Semitism go way back. And we remember that less than a year ago, on the campus of the University of Virginia, men walking around with tiki torches saying Jews will not replace us. So to think that it's over is mistaken. And this is the conundrum that organizations like the San Francisco Bach Choir encounter. There's basically 4 choices when it comes to performing the Bach passions, right? The first one is to not perform it, to make the decision that it shouldn't be performed. Richard Taruskin, who's at Berkeley as an emeritus professor, has argued this for some time. He says it's a masterpiece, it's a paradigm of artistic excellence. He says excellence matters, but there are things that matter more. And to the extent that the St. John Passion and the music of Bach, for Bach's time and for our time, does anything to advocate for violence against the Jews, that needs to be taken into consideration. The second is to just play it like it's a concert piece and let people not come if they don't want to, right? Not engage with the issues of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. The third is to try to fix it, which is to boulderize the text. So instead of die Juden schrien kreuzige, kreuzige, the Jews cried, crucify him, crucify him, you change it to the people cried, crucify him, crucify him. You try to just soften it a little bit. Right? And the fourth is the one that I've always advocated for, and which is why I'm so pleased that this Bach choir has done it, is to have the performance but to bring it up, to bring up the issues and to think about it. And certainly, John, you've given us a lot to think about. Now, Bach is writing, as I said, 45% of the text is the Gospel of John, 55% is religious poetry that comments on the action, right? And that commentary, written by his colleagues in the clergy, very influenced, as Bach himself was, because he was a deeply erudite scholar in Lutheran theology. So now we'll hear about Luther and his position in all of this, keeping in mind that Luther was a huge influence on Bach. So Kirsi Sterna is here. She's a professor of Lutheran history and theology at the Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary up in Berkeley, and the editor of the book called Martin Luther, the Bible and the Jewish People. Kirsi, welcome. Thank you so much.
So much has already been said. I feel that we're eager to discuss, but I have about 10 minutes thoughts to share. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here in this wonderful panel and on this topic. So I speak here as a Bach lover, but not as a Bach scholar. I'm a Luther scholar. I'm also an ordained Lutheran pastor, teaching students how to proclaim with the Lutheran lens. So this is a very important topic for my daily work. I also speak as a woman married to a person who teaches Hebrew scriptures and Hebrew language, and my granddaughter is a Jew. So now we talk about the Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yeah.
Oh, I wish, but no. How many of you saw that on Sunday? It's actually quite amazing. Yeah. Okay, I titled my few words, Tainted Beauty on Bach, Luther, and Anti-Semitism. Human experience is lived between two extremes, the greatest of joys and the deepest of sorrows. Humans in their being bear the possibilities within the extremes of divine goodness and the darkness of terror, building and destruction, love and hate. I believe that Bach's music can be appreciated in this spectrum. This human being created some of the most beautiful music ever written that touches deep our core. At the same time, we do hear the tainted pieces with which he created heavenly music. I'm talking about the negative words about the Jews. What do we make with the hateful words written into beautiful music? The words, as we have learned, we know, come from a holy source, one of the Christian Gospels. The Gospel of John, one of the most complex Gospels, I would say, makes several negative references to the Jews as the enemies of Christ and as enemies of God and light, as those on the side of the devil in the cosmic battle between good and evil. The Gnostic influence is its own complex nut to crack with this gospel, but if we have time, we can talk about that. The gospel presents Jesus, the Jew, as the embodiment of wisdom and as the Passover lamb who brings freedom for those who are his. The Gospels are complicated, and it is good to remember that Bach did not write any of them, but they were his sources. So what does it matter to us in assessing Bach's intentions and value? Could we just ignore the librettos and continue to value the vocal, the sound, the beauty, as if apart from the theology that inspired Bach as a Christian Lutheran theologian? Because Bach was quite theologically and biblically educated, as Michael Marison calls musical preacher, or I would call him musical theologian. It is not possible to dismiss the words in his music as pure adornments and without a meaning. Quite the contrary is the case. The words reveal to us both the substance of Bach's theology, and they give us a reference point to his theological opinions he perhaps expresses in creative ways as a musician, whose daily job was to work with the Christian theological text in Lutheran congregations and their worship. We have sources to prove how Bach worked with this theology. We know he used Luther's translation of the Bible, and we know that he left a heavily marked color Bible commentary that offers researchers valuable clues to his thinking process. As a noted Bach scholar, Michael Marison, has concluded, so we can be sure that in preparing his musical setting, Bach had a thorough knowledge of the Gospel according to John and its Lutheran interpretation. Lutheran theology was the particular lens to the Gospels Bach had inherited. Luther was Bach's primary theological compass. Also, concretely, the text from John 18:19 in the Passion comes to Bach from Luther's Bible translation with his translation decisions. So in addition to the Gospel of John, we can name Luther as a source of Bach in his anti-Jewish insinuations. So Martin Luther, the 16th century German reformer, was curious about Jewish faith and the Hebrew language. He was starting kind of a new trend, or part of the new trend, that let us Christians learn about Hebrew again and learn how to speak the language, read the language, and read the Hebrew scriptures that had been so hidden from Christian readers. He wished in his writings throughout his career to confute, reject Jewish readings of the scriptures. He wrote against the Jewish religion throughout his career, and particularly vehemently towards the end of his life. We could say he had an issue. Like Willie Nelson sings, Luther had Jews on his mind, like always on his mind. It's like he could not make a theological statement without imagining a Jewish counter-argument. His point, I believe, was not hatred of his fellow human beings, but rather he considered the Jewish religion dead. In his effort to explain his big discovery of God's grace that has changed his life and career, he considered those Jews who are not willing to convert to Christianity a danger, like an illness to the rest of humanity. That was his motivation to try to convert and refute this faith. Judaism as a religion for Luther was an obstacle on the way of the gospel. Judaism was like a dead corpse. He uses that expression. Practicing Jews were enemies of the gospel and Christians. So in Luther's world, 16th century, earlier than Bach, where Christianity dominated, it was utterly permissible to slander the Jews in art, humor, text, table talks, in music. What we heard from you, this description of the realities in Luther's times, those were the realities already in the Middle Ages, how Jews' lives were regulated and how Jews were conceived and how they were objectified and mocked. It was permissible to feature anti-Jewish imagery and music at churches. Some of those remnants are still there. Horrible, horrific reliefs in Christian churches, left there on purpose as a reminder, not to wash it away. So this is the milk, this anti-Jewish Christian air, milk is what Bach drank with Luther. This was the foundation on which Bach wrote music for Christian theology and as a Christian theologian. It is relatively recent that Christians have awakened to consider the problems with the anti-Jewish pieces embedded in Christian theologies and imaginations. But it's in the post-Holocaust reality we are deeply aware of the need to name the seeds and roots and feeders and ramifications of all kinds of anti-Semitism in order to stop the change of hate. We want to name anti-Semitism where we see it, even when it involves such beloved figures as Luther and Bach. We do that noting that the word in itself was invented later, after both men were dead and buried. The term anti-Semitism comes from the 19th century. Expressions of anti-Semitism, I wish we could say that those were the days. Let's look at that historically. But tragically, expressions of anti-Semitism are not part of history only, but they are very much alive and increasingly permissible as if in our current context. And this is alarming. And that ugly reality alone makes this conversation today necessary and in its own way a way to condemn and confess against anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic attitudes and actions. Just us being here today to talk about this is a form of confession and condemnation of any forms of anti-Semitic actions and attitudes. I want to end with a couple of questions and an insight from Michael Marison. I already mentioned a couple of times, and I'm very grateful for his work, and for Brandon Beck, my fellow, my student, who did some digging on Bach and sources for me, and found this wonderful work from Michael Marison that I'm going to now draw from. But first, I wonder, and I think I got some answer already from previous presentations. What exposure did Bach have to Jewish people and Jewish faith? I mean, he may have seen Jews out there, but did he actually have any personal relation with any Jewish person other than a convert? And I'm asking that because I know that in Luther's case, that made all the difference. Luther, who wrote so much about the Jews as if they are everywhere, didn't know any Jewish persons. He had never broken bread with a Jew. He'd never been to a wedding. He just talked about this imaginary other, the imaginary other. And I wonder what the difference it might have made for Luther had he had a chance to meet a person and know about the Jewish practice from actually practicing Jew. And the same with Bach. I mean, that's a piece that I don't know the answer to, but I think it's a relevant question. Second, I wonder, and this is where I totally have no idea, but I wonder, did Bach musically in any way perhaps challenge any of the prevalent anti-Jewish theology, anti-Semitism that is so embedded in the Christian texts that he's working with? Is there another tone or story or interpretation to listen with Bach? We're all hoping, right? So Michael Marison suggests that Bach does something interesting in his reading of the St. John's Gospel. He's referring to one contemporary scholarly solution for how to read difficult biblical text. And that is, quote, we can update the gospel, let's say in this case St. John's, by leaving the text in itself intact, but interpreting in it theologically, reading to some degree as if against the text. This is what feminists have been doing forever with patriarchal medicine to a text. But anyway, it's worth considering, reading a text as if against the text. When this approach is taken, Marison says, reading John theologically in light of the much greater emphasis on Christian sin and forgiveness that Luther found in Paul's writings in the New Testament, then Bach's St. John Passion looks considerably less anti-Jewish than the gospel text itself. End of quote. More from Marison? Yes. He says, Bach's view can be inferred from the strong verbal and musical emphasis he places on an essential point of Lutheran theology, that all humans except Jesus was tainted by human sin, are guilty and in need of redemption. More on Marison. Marison says, Bach sets John's unaltered passion narrative to music that in no way palliates ugly aspects of the story, but at the same time, looking at the whole, Bach is posing the question, who is actually accountable for Jesus' crucifixion, according to St. John's Passion? Marison says the commentary hymn following on Jesus' being struck by one of the attendants of the Jews expresses matters most forcibly. The words, it's I, referring to Bach's Lutheran congregants. It's I, the congregants, who crucified Jesus. Who has struck you so? I and my sins, which are as numerous as the grains of sand on the seashore, they have caused you the sorrow that strikes you and the grievous host of pain. In a recent email exchange about this St. John's Passion, Teresa Bell wrote about her discoveries as a singer of this piece, and I'm quoting Teresa here with her permission. I was startled to see how often the chorus changes in an instant from malice to tenderness, greed to humility, hatred to love. Same people inhabiting all those human realities. That tells me something about who the Jews are meant to represent. This is a really powerful and helpful realization. To conclude, theologically speaking and spiritually speaking, and I speak as a theologian, Bach's music calls humanity for repentance and honesty, just as it inspires and has the power to transform. To use Lutheran terms of law and gospel, Bach's music, with its very tainted pieces and its obvious beauty, calls us to see ourselves in a mirror and repent and be transformed. And that's what good critical theology does. And I consider Bach a pretty good critical theologian. Thank you.
Thank you. So, thank you all to all three of you. Appreciate it very much. There's a lot of different rabbit holes we can go down. Let's start, Jonathan, with the rabbit hole of Jesus himself. The Gospel of John, and its mentions, its negative depictions of the Jews. Jesus himself is not immune from that. In the 8th chapter, the 42nd verse, he says to a group of Jewish leaders, "You don't believe me because you are from the devil. Your father is from the devil. You will always be from the devil, and you don't have any chance, essentially, of redemption." So what is the scholarship about Jesus's culpability, if you will, individually for promulgating the notion of what later became anti-Semitism? He's of course a Jew himself, but is there any culpability on the part of him as an actor in this drama?
That's a good question. I mean, it's a theological question at some level. So I don't know if the theologian, I want to pass the buck to her at some level. I mean, insofar as, the way I, as a historian of things biblical, would answer that more with reference to how John is thinking about Jesus rather than how Jesus himself is seen as a kind of voice for certain kinds of anti-Semitic attitudes that later will be concretized by different Christian communities. Since the words of Christ come through these different variegated traditions, there's always the possibility of taking one set of his enunciations and having next to them another set of enunciations that you could profitably read back and forth, whether it's against the grain or sort of complementary forms. So the fact that Christ and Gospel of John is read by the John author as expressing these kinds of vehement forms of of separation and discrimination, wouldn't be found in the Synoptic Gospels to nearly the same extent. So I think that I don't know if there's a scholarship that, and maybe actually John might have some views of this as well, if there's a scholarship that says that the real problem here is actually Jesus, forgetting all of these gospel accounts. It's actually, the problem was that Christ himself had this project, the project of demonizing Jews and celebrating the community of the Messianic community that he was trying to create. I can't think of scholars who make that kind of argument, but maybe John does. It's an interesting point of view.
Yeah, I don't think, to the best of my knowledge, there's not. But I will say one thing, that the trope of the Jews as satanic, as children of the devil, is one of the most powerful of the anti-Semitic tropes. Really expounded upon and elaborated, I'd say first by the church fathers, particularly say Chrysostom, perhaps above all, which then becomes, takes and then after, that's sort of 2nd and 3rd and 4th century church fathers, but it really becomes much more deeply imprinted in the minds of Christian Europe during the Middle Ages, with actual iconography and depictions of the Jews as devils and with horns. So it doesn't exactly answer your question, but that passage of children of the devil, Satan, is a really damaging and long-lasting trope.
Take a look at your texts that you have to speak to Kiersey's point about, does Bach do anything to counter the argument of Jewish culpability for the death of Jesus? Right? So one good place to look, both in this piece and in the St. Matthew Passion, is the moment that Jesus dies. How does Bach handle that particular moment? Right? In St. Matthew Passion, we hear the 5th iteration of the Passion Chorale, which is usually translated in English, "O sacred head now wounded with crown of piercing thorn," right? So that is played 5 times in the Matthew Passion. The first time it's in E major. The second time, after Peter denies knowing Jesus, it goes to E flat major. It sinks a half a step. Thank you. The next time, it's in D major, another half step down. The next time after that, it's in D minor. And then the last time after Jesus dies, it's in A minor, and it ends in the key of E major, which is to say it's lost. Because chorales in Bach's time started and ended in the same key. But this one wanders all over the place and ends up in E major, completely lost. And the chorale is, "Wenn ich einmal so scheiden, so scheide nicht von mir." When it's my time to go, don't leave me. So he individualizes the moment of Jesus' death. Again, the culpability being on the sinners in the congregation in the Thomaskirche of Leipzig, right? In number 32, in the St. John Passion, Jesus dies and the evangelist tells us, "Neiget das Haupt und verschied." He bowed his head and died. So then what does Bach decide to do at that moment? He has a chorale in addition to interpolated around a baritone solo, Mein teuer Heiland, right? So look at the end of this. Du kannst von Schmerzen, it's like 1, 2, 3, in the English translation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 up from the bottom. You can in agony, it is true, say nothing. And then the italic part is what the chorale is singing, right? But you bow your head and say in silence, yes, right? That's all I need. I don't need to hear anything else, right? Can I, through your pain and death, inherit the kingdom of heaven? That's the question that he asks. And in Jesus' agony, he says, yes. So Jesus' agony is caused by the need for redemption of the individual sinner. And there's no mention of Jews, there's no mention of Pilate, there's no mention of anybody except, can my salvation happen? And Jesus says, yes, at the moment of his death. The other one you want to look to is number 19. There are places that stick out like a sore thumb in the St. John Passion. And number 19, another baritone solo. Right? Ponder my soul with anxious delight. This happens after the Jews appear to abandon their fellow Jew, Jesus, because Pilate says, who do you want me to release, Jesus or Barabbas? And they say, release Barabbas. This betrayal, this abandonment of Jesus, right? So the baritone sings a piece that is orchestrated in a way that is completely different than any other movement of the oratorio. Right? It's scored for flutes, oboes, strings, continuo, bassoon, right? And all of that sort of disappears for a moment. And in the original production of this, he played this on a lute. Sometimes it's played on the harpsichord, sometimes it's played on the organ, but there's not a whole lot going on. There's an obligato string thing, but the texture of this aria just pops out at you. Which is to say, Bach is saying, pay real close attention to this one. The chorales all basically sound the same. The chorales sing, and the chorus sings the chorales. When they're singing the chorales, they are commenting on the action. When they are singing as Romans or Jews or crowds or whatever, they are part of the action. But in this one, betrachte meine Seele, right? In Jesus' agony, your highest good, how from the thorns that pierce him, heavenly flowers bloom. You can pick much sweet fruit from his bitter wormwood as he hangs on the cross, or he's about to hang on the cross. So, drum sieh und unterlass auf ihn. Do not take your eyes off of him. This is because of you. And he makes that aria pop out. Because no other aria, no other chorus, no other movement, no other second of this piece sounds like that. And then the one that Kirsi alluded to. Why is Jesus dying? Ich und meine Sünde. Me and my sins. So this is why at least I'm comfortable conducting this piece in the Matthew Passion, because I'm saying Bach makes the theological argument that the culpability for the death of Jesus is not on the Jews, but it is on the individual singers. That's the theological argument. But here's the fact of the matter is, 1517, Luther does the 95 Theses, and then much later, towards the end of his life, he publishes a 65,000-word treatise on the Jews and their lives. And he says, he gives a 10-point thing about what you should do when you encounter a Jew. Hurt them on the highways, steal their books, burn their synagogues, make sure that they are relegated to hard labor, the sweat of the brow. Right? So the virulence of that, the vitriol there is remarkable and something that's difficult, I think, to reconcile for the father of the Lutheran tradition, the father of the Protestant tradition writ large. Please.
Though you refer to the late treatises, but throughout his career, Luther wrote very, very vehemently about the Jewish faith. But it's towards the end of his life, as there were still Jews in the area, he considered it is important to take some action to really help the Jews to move to another land, so that they would not be. Why is this not working? No. My phone just fell above. Oh, sorry, my hair. Sorry. And Luther was not the only one who wrote like that. Johann Eck, his Catholic arch enemy, his colleagues. It was the point I was trying to make is that Christian theologians were trained to try to argue against any other religious views, and Jewish religious views the only other. People didn't really know about Muslim, or they definitely didn't know about Buddhism, Hinduism. So the problem really is in how Christians have read the scriptures, and all problems go back to Jesus. How do you understand who Jesus was? And especially for Christians like Luther, to whom the story of Jesus really transformed his life, it became both a professional thing when he has to, with his profession, argue against any other competing interpretation of the holy text that would make Christ look irrelevant. That would have ruined him, destroyed him. So the passion, so this doesn't make the issue go away, but it helps us to understand the fire and the passion, and the very negative passion. It comes from that originally was something positive for him. He found Christ in the scriptures. And with that fire, in the end, he loses his patience. And if you don't get this love of God, then you need to go somewhere else. And he writes those horrible statements that actually were translated in 1930s in different languages in Europe. And there were people who make explicit connection during Nazi era to Luther's writings and see, we have a father centuries ago who already told us what to do with them Jews. So it's really the biblical interpretation is a very dangerous thing. We could talk about other issues today also where we draw from our Bible very different opinions that become enemy of one another with the arguments we draw from what we call Holy Scriptures.
John, how did Jews horrifyingly describe the oppression that was just in every second of their day? How did Jews respond to the charge of deism? Did they have a response in any way, shape,
Look, by 1700, it's 1700 years old. So all the protestations about not having been responsible have fallen on deaf ears. So, Jews, like most sane people, don't want to fight a losing battle. So there's nothing to say about that anymore. I will just say one thing, though, about this text. Luther wrote this text in 1523 called that Jesus Christ was born a Jew. It's a little softer around the edges than his text of 1543, which is called On the Jews and Their Lies. And the thing about this 1543 text is that it was informed by a text. I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but it was informed by a text that came out in 1830, which was the beginning of a genre of texts written by a convert to Christianity by a guy by the name of Antonius Margarita. Antonius Margarita happened to be the grandson of the chief rabbi of Regensburg. He set in train an entire genre of not conversion narratives, not how I came to Jesus, but essentially tell-all books, exposés. This is what the Jews are really up to, and you're getting it now from the horse's mouth, because I used to be one. And so what's significant about them and what is sort of modern about them is that they're theological at one level, but they are 100% ethnographic. So we go from the realm of the theological to real flesh and blood Jews, which is how I ended my remarks about this very important text that was 200 years later on Jewish curiosities. But you can really move from the abstract realm to the realm of social reality. That text is 200 years earlier. When we get to Luther's On the Jews and Their Lies, the 10 points that Tom made are a 10-point policy. There are no accusation in that particular list that the Jews have killed Jesus, the Jews are responsible for this or that. He's gone beyond that. The Jews are guilty as charged, and here's what you have to do. They should be expelled. They should be given absolutely no safe passage on highways, which means it's absolutely open season on them. He specifically points out Jewish women. Jewish women should be, into their hands should be put a hoe, so they will do hard labor. These are people that sit around, and this is from the text, that the Jews sit around, you'll excuse my language, the Jews sit around feasting and farting. That's what the Jews do. So they should be put to hard labor. Their property should be taken. All their synagogues should be burned. Their books should be burned. And so we're in a different kind, I mean, it's a religious text, right? But it is a different kind of religious text, even from ones that he had written before. It is now, there are real people unto whom you do things.
Let's, Jonathan, the couple of questions about what this notion of the Jews, Jude in Greek and the Juden in the German Bible, means. Paul Fredrickson and others have said that it was, for a long time, a Jew was a person from Judea, as opposed to a Samaritan or a Galilean or a Nazarene. So at what point does the Jews in the courtyard with Pilate become the Jews writ large through history equally culpable for the death of Jesus?
I think that, I mean, so in the, there's a nice literature on this sort of stuff. So in the John Gospel, the Jews seem to more or less refer to something like Jewish authorities, more or less. Often in the Gospels, the Jews are the Jewish authorities. And there might be different ones. In some of the Gospels, they're the temple authorities, so the Sadducees. In John's Gospels, he seems to have not really had much to do with the temple in Jerusalem, probably in Palestine somewhere further afield. So his main opponents are sort of more sort of everyday Pharisaic Jews. And when he talks about the Jews, he means people from Judea, or he means specifically Jewish authorities, that is people, and those are the people that he's fighting with, people who he says want to, say, kick you out of the synagogue and so forth. And ordinary Jews wouldn't have the right to kick you out of the synagogue, so he's talking about authorities. But by the time we're in, I mean, already Paul is talking about the Jews in a kind of in a more general sense, and thinking about the difference between Jew and Gentile, for example, as a kind of category decision between two different forms of life, ways of commitment, orientations toward the world. So it doesn't, I don't think, take very much to go from what I think are more kind of communitarian specific references to the Jews in the gospel stories to more general references to Jews over and against Gentiles in Paul's letters. And by the time you're in the Church Fathers, it's clear that they were already talking about Jews as now an entire sort of superseded religious group. So it doesn't. This is a quick set of transfigurations that's happening as the Christian community constitutes itself as its own kind of community.
Here's a question for...
Just by the time you get to the Church Fathers, terms like some Jews or a Jew is missing entirely. It's always the Jews. It's the Jews. So as a collective responsible for everything and anything and everything.
Here's a question. John is the gospel of choice in the lectionary for Holy Week, especially Good Friday. Any new Christians know that. Are there larger liturgical reforms or conversations that need to happen at the congregational level? And what might this look like? The FBI will tell you that the incidences of desecrations of synagogues and Jewish seminaries traditionally spike on Good Friday. That there are more of those sorts of crimes committed on Good Friday. The difference between like 2013 and 2009, it was up 40%. I mean, 40%, a lot more happening in the middle of the Obama administration than at the beginning of the Obama administration. So in terms of liturgical form, because people, when they hear the Passion narrative, they don't hear it from Matthew a lot. They hear it from John. And the John narrative is a very different narrative. You know, there's no Passover in the John Gospel. He doesn't go to, he goes to the garden, the Romans come out, they look for him, they say, we're looking for Jesus, and his attitude to the soldiers is very defiant. He said, who do you want? What's your problem? In Matthew, he's in the garden, he's crying, he's upset, his friends have abandoned him, he's saying, Father, if this cup can pass from me, he's like a totally different human being. So what about the decision to do the John narrative of the Passion as opposed to the other option?
Oh yeah, so this has to happen, right? In our seminary, first of all, we teach Luther and the Jews. We teach different courses where we address this issue from different angles, but we also, let me talk about how we deal with this with our students who will be pastored. We want to make sure that there will be reforms like that. It is irresponsible to continue lectionaries as if they don't matter. But there's also something called liturgical police out there. Try changing the liturgist's view. People who are gifted in taking care of the liturgical calendars, they're very, there's a lot of work to be done, but it starts from naming what is problem, even in the holiest of days and the holiest of texts, and being willing to humble oneself to consider that maybe the text is wrong, maybe we are wrong. Is there another way to talk about God than repeating? And this is a huge reform. It's going to be painful, but it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah. Here's a comment about the Matthew Gospel and the St. Matthew Passion. Remember, I said that piece as an oratorio of Bach is 3 hours long. Right? There is a very troubling one line in the Gospel of Matthew. It is considerably overall less troubling in terms of anti-Semitism than the Gospel of John, which, as we talk about, is rife with negative allusions to the Jewish people. But in Matthew, Pilate goes out on the balcony and he says, who do you want me to release? And they say Barabbas, and he says, well, what am I supposed to do with Jesus? He seems to be innocent to me. Pilate is trying to play it both ways, right? And they say in the Luther's translation, the blood curse. His blood on us and our children's children, which is the thing that immortalizes it, which is the thing that extends it past the group of people in the courtyard to Jews writ large. Right? So the difference between the Matthew story and the John story. Any comment about that? And in terms of the blood, you have two things in Matthew that are kind of interesting. One is the blood curse. The other is the so-called Great Commission in the 28th chapter, where the commission is to go out and convert. The commission is not to understand that somebody else has a different take on this. The commission is to go out and persuade them to your side. Any thoughts about that?
Well, my thought, I think it's more about this. It's not, for me, it's interesting, not so much the individual. So if you go through the four Gospels and you line up the things that the Gospel authors have to say about Jews that tend to be, in general, not very positive. And in some way, when I was reading through Bach's libretto, it's not any worse. It's sort of standard fare at some level from the kind of perspective of a gospel reader to look through this and think, well, that looks kind of more or less like what is said reasonably often in Christian literature about the Jews. What's interesting about the John Gospel, from my perspective, versus the Matthew Gospel, is how the entire structure of the John Gospel is set up as a series of conflicts in order to produce something like a difference between a holy community and an unholy community. So what's interesting about Matthew as a text is that it seems to offer different kinds of possibilities for what kind of thing Christianity might be. Might it be interested in a kind of beatitudes as a set of internal prescriptions and regulations on one's own life, as opposed to seeing those internal prescriptions and regulations on one's own life only as a way of creating a difference between one's community and a community that's outside, which is named in the John Gospel as the Jews. So it's not that you couldn't find in Matthew things that are, I think, in that passage is the particular one, the blood curse passage, that is as disturbing as any single thing you can find in the John Gospel. It's just that the structure of the John Gospel makes it much harder to ignore the difference that marks even the most minor parable that you'll find in the John Gospel is marked by this interest.
I am the keeper of the clock, and we have to stop. I am the one between you and the beautiful cookies that are out there. And I want to give John you the last word here. One last question from our audience. The situation of German Jews improved in the 19th century, did it not? So why? What happened? How did that happen? And did Bach? And it obviously, it went south again, in the 1930s. But what happened to improve it, at least temporarily?
Well, welcome to the last 30 years of my life, right. and every day trying to work this out. The question is this: if things were so bad, how come they were so good? So by that I mean as follows: Germany is I don't mean this in a trite way. The history of anti-Semitism in Germany is extremely complicated. So I'll give you one example. 1933, and I know this one because I've written a book about this, but if you take 1933, 50% of all the doctors in Berlin were Jewish. It was 60% in Vienna, right? If you're keeping score at home, 67% of the dentists, right? 48% of all the lawyers. It goes on and on and on and on. At the same time, the Jews were already not as Jews, but by coincidence, winning Nobel Prizes for medicine in Germany. In the United States, Jews couldn't get into medical schools. They couldn't get into universities. Germany had no quotas, despite all of its anti-Semites clamoring. They ended up having no impact whatsoever until 1933. So Germany was, in many respects, with all of its anti-Semitism, a land of opportunity. This so-called land of opportunity here had quotas. Yale had quotas till 1961. Couldn't get in, right? Very late, for example, in the Ivy Leagues. So there were opportunities created by access to education, and Jews became professionals in numbers that were enormous. One of the problems is that from their perspective, from the Jewish perspective, this is sort of the tragedy, the internal tragedy of the situation. For a very long time, beginning sort of around the time of Bach's death in 1750, there begin a series of debates as to whether the Jews can and should be emancipated. Can they become German? Can they become European? Because they were considered to be an Asiatic people, an Oriental people, not European. Okay. If you emancipate them, will they become European? And eventually, that informed Jewish behaviour. So you had a sort of an attempt by German Jews to, I mean, not an attempt, but they became more German than the Germans, right? So dedicated were they to the adoption of German culture, German language. But the way they did it, and here's the tragedy, the way they did it made them look, instead of more and more German, stand out as much as they ever did before in the period that I was talking about. Because if in 1900, for every, without getting into details, just gigantic disproportional presence in every field of endeavour, from medicine to music and everything in between, made them look very unlike the average German. But from the Jewish perspective, they thought they had done everything that was asked of them to become German. But the average German is not reading leather-bound volumes of Goethe and Schiller and attending concerts. And if you look at the subscriber names to symphonies and operas, you'll see a disproportional presence, as you know. And so the more they thought they looked like Germans, the less they actually were like the average German. And then it came back to bite them 33.
You are not the average American because you are here thinking about this. And God bless you for it. The question is, fundamentally, if we agree that there's a big fire here, a fire of anti-Semitic thought, action, and philosophy, does Bach, as a composer, throw gas on that fire or water? I think the argument can be made that he's putting water on the fire. However, it's a big fire. So the amount of water he puts on it perhaps is not sufficient to the cause to douse it. But let's look for where the water is, and let's understand where the potential for gasoline is in the music that this great genius writes, and what I'm sure is going to be beautiful performances by the choir. So thanks to the panel, thanks to all of you.